a couple talks today, and his first one is Back to Basics: Why Pollination Can Be Poor and What, if anything, you can do about it.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so we're going to go back to basics here on pollination. This whole session has some great talks on pollination. You're going to walk out of this room having pollination nailed. I do have these clickers. If you're just coming into the room, grab one of those clickers. They're right over there. You can also grab one of those beautiful little pictures of the bees of Oregon, which are identical to the bees of Washington, I promise. Okay, so you got these clickers in your hands, and what I want you to do to start with, I know we got a mixed crowd here, so I just want to get a sense of who you are. To begin with, I just want, when we come to football, which way do you lean? I would hope to see some beavers, in which case I really would encourage you to hit the A button. If you're a Huskies fan, B. C if you were with the Cougars. If you're with the Ducks, I don't know why you're here. But there may be some BC Lions fans in the room. 9 losses, I just want to point out. And the Calgary Stampeders have just won the Grey Cup. If you're a Stamps fan, if you're from BC, you hate the Stamps. So I'll be able to figure out by subtraction who you are. Okay, so there we go. We've got 5 responses to this question. Oh, 7. And so I'm going to hit the button. You know how this works. Comes up. And wow, not a single beaver fan in the room. This is going to be a tough crowd today. Okay, is anybody in here? Are you all blueberry growers? Just hit A. And if we have a caneberry grower, I don't expect to see any cranberry growers here, but who knows? It's my first time here. All right, I'm going to hit the button. Thanks for voting, everybody. Bong, there it goes. Other. Of those 7 people, what did I miss here? What was some of the others? Yeah. Raspberry, did I hear? Okay, all right. All right, as you come in here, grab one of those clickers. Okay, I want to ask you now, was pollination adequate in 2018? Did you feel that you had adequate pollination in 2018? If you said yes, go A. You have no idea, hit C, and B for no. All right. The answer is not showing. So I'm going to keep that secret. But let's go to this next question. Was the problem primarily that the stocking rate wasn't high enough, do you think? Was the problem that the colonies were weak? Were the problem weather conditions or native bees? You're attributing it mostly to native bees, or was it something else? E. There's a beaver fan. Where were you? Yeah, okay. And for some reason, it's not showing the answer. I will know later. Okay, but here we go. Are you planning to do anything different in 2019? Actually, no. When it comes to pollination, you got a good system in place. You're not changing a thing. You're going to be increasing your stocking rate. You're going to get a new beekeeper. You're going to put in pollinator habitat. You're going to use an attractant for the first time, or something else that's not listed here. All right. There we go. Okay, so there's a bunch of you, there's a quarter of you going to be putting in habitat. That's interesting. And pollinator attractants. And some of you are going to give the boot to your old beekeeper. But there's a lot of you, you've got a good system in place that's working. That's awesome. Okay, so today, this is what we're going to do. As I mentioned, Tim Lawrence has come in the room. We've got some great talks from WSU. We're going to be covering all of this material. I'm just going to give a broad overview of why fruit set isn't perfect and if you can do anything about it. So here we go. Here's a blueberry plant. There's 100 ovules there, and they got to be, to get the size of that fruit's going to really, in some measure, depend on whether those ovules are fertilized or not. So the stigmas are going to have to get that pollen put onto that surface for the 4 days that they're receptive. They're going to tunnel down through that style. down to the ovules. And the problem is in blueberry, it's not like a sunflower where the pollen is on the outside. Here, the pollen is tucked away in these poricidal anthers. They got to be shooken out like a salt shaker to get the pollen to come out. And we already know, actually, that pollination does increase. With pollination, you're going to get higher fruit. This is over in New York State with 3 varieties. You're going to get bigger berries, and you can bump the harvest date earlier. Okay, so the first question is, why doesn't pollen move enough in the first place? Why isn't it moving enough? The first thing is that you don't have enough bees. And I have 3 copies of OSU's publication, Evaluating Honeybee Colonies for Pollination, and you're supposed to have, according to this publication, 3 hives per acre, and the colonies should be fairly strong as a spring colony. You should be able to go across that box and see 3 frames of bees, 6 frames with brood, but some of you are too shy to do this or don't have that arrangement with your beekeeper, so if you can sit out front of the colony. This OSU publication says, and if you see 100 bees per minute flying at above 65 Fahrenheit and at low wind speeds, that should give you a pollination grade colony. Now, Dr. DeVetter's done some great work. You've got a great researcher here in Mount Vernon, and she pointed out, and going through a number of sites, and you see that optimal 100 bees per minute is not being achieved. In 2 different years, east and west of the Cascades, there is an issue with getting these colonies up to strength. Now, how do you know if you don't have enough bees? Well, the first thing is you can go in front of your bushes and you should see 4 to 8 bees bouncing around per bush. That's adequate pollination. And you should also not have this condition where, you have petals that are browning on the stem. Okay. So how many colonies are optimal? In your head, when you think about it, when you sort of, your own observations, do you think actually you don't need pollination? It's all a scam by researchers? Is it 1 to 4 colonies per acre, 5 to 8, you think? Or do you think you really got to go higher? Like you got to go to E? Cast your vote. So what you think, money is no concern here. It's just like, I could go plateau at this number. You can vote again if you didn't quite get the question. Okay. 5 to 8. So that's what you think is optimal. 5 to 8 colonies per acre. And there's at least one of you in this room who's like, you got to go big or go home. Great. Okay. Just out of curiosity, I know prices are kind of weak. How many colonies per acre are you going to use in 2019? You know what's optimal, but what are you going to use this year? What's your sort of feeling? Is it something that you might cut back on because of the prices? Or is it kind of like an input that you can't do without, like a herbicide? Okay. Okay, I see a shift down to lower stocking rates compared to what you think is optimal. Okay, that's good to know, but that 112 colony per acre guy is still out there. Steadfast. So there is research that shows that when you increase, so you see on the y-axis there, it's observed honeybee visits, how many bees visits you're getting, and you can bump that up by increasing the stocking rate locally. This is an interesting research study, though, because you can imagine when you're cheek by jowl next to your neighbors and you look at stocking rates at a farm-wide level, they weren't able to establish the relationship. So there is a way in which, like, its stocking rate on your farm seems to be the significant factor. We've got a podcast at OSU. You can download it. It's called Pollination, and we had Matt Arrington here from Mount Vernon point out that he's been able to show in the DeVetter lab that at 8 hives per acre, you're increasing yield. And in fact, where that stops, nobody knows. Here's the study. If you look at the bee visits per minute, clearly in 2 years of the study, if you go from 4 to 8 hives to acre, you are going to increase the visits to those bushes. In addition to that, it translates into increases in yield. I want to go to cranberry since there's no cranberry growers in the room, and just a cranberry study that I find really interesting. This is down in Bend in Oregon. We have a small cranberry industry on the south coast. And they had this really interesting study where they looked at hives per acre and they modeled it. I'm sorry, this is like too graphy for morning talk, but bear with me, this is pretty cool. So you can see on that one line, it's like a straight black line, it's the yield of cranberries against hives per acre, and it's flat. You add additional colonies and you don't get any additional yield. But that dotted line, you get this line that goes up to space. You can keep adding colonies up and getting higher yield. What they show, well, it doesn't go to space. It kind of plateaus at 4.9 colonies per acre. What the difference between these two lines is the amount of forest surrounding those bogs. So there's a way in which the forest land cover surrounding the bogs affects how much yield you're going to get, which in some ways, for many of you, makes sense. You've got big leaf maple around your fields, you've got honeybees, and they're both blooming at the same time. Your bees may not be visiting your blueberries. And in this study, what they found was on the bottom, look at that side number. It says percent woodland within 1 kilometer. If you go right down to the bottom where it's 80% woodland within 1 kilometer of that cranberry bog, and you see the red means there's a yield increase, blue means no increase. You can see there's no increase by adding additional colonies. But when you get less and less woodland surrounding that field, then you can start to get these bump ups. And they show here that from 2 to 5 colonies per acre, you have to have a sort of threshold of surrounding woodland, you can get this increase. Now, obviously, cranberry is blooming a lot later than blueberry, so there are early varieties of blueberry where this may not come into play, but clearly as you get into surrounding bloom, this is a problem. The second reason why you might not have ideal fruit set is you don't have the right bees. So this is a nice study from New Jersey, and you can see the amount of pollen grains deposited by a honeybee, you can see it's 7 on average, is not nearly as much as something like a bumblebee. Oh, yeah, so we've got nectar forager and pollen foragers, 7 to 24. So, and a bee there that's robbing, that's going through the side of the flower like you often see on blue crop, they're not doing any pollination. But you can see a bumblebee can really bump up the amount of pollen that's being deposited. This is another study. It's an old study from British Columbia, and they looked at the percentage of bees that were carrying blueberry pollen when they returned home. And you can see with the honeybee, that level is quite low. It's a lot of honeybees they have a hard time getting the pollen out to begin with, and they've got a good long flight range, so they may not stick on the crop. Bumblebees much higher. They're really adapted to getting the pollen out of a blueberry flower. And then the top, interestingly enough, is a bee that we don't use in blueberry pollination, the mason bee. You see here, they don't have a very long flight range. They're kind of restricted. You put their nests in a blueberry field, they're kind of stuck there. And most of the pollen that they were bringing back to the nest is blueberry pollen, which is very interesting. There are a lot of these native bees around your fields. This is a cranberry bog. There's a whole bunch of Colides nests in this bank by the bog. And in Oregon, what we've seen in cranberry in particular, on South Coast cranberry, 68% of the visits are coming from honeybees, but in some places you can get quite high. And the South Coast is a great place for bumblebees, and 31% of the visits are coming from bumblebees. The top visit coming from Bombus vozesensky or yellow-headed bumblebee, but there's some other bumblebees that are playing a role. And this is a grower down in Bend, and we made a whole bunch of these boxes, and they're getting really good occupancy rates. You put these boxes, you band them to the tree, and you can see they're a messy bee. There's a lot of poop and pollen on the front, but there they go. They nest on the sides of the bogs. Okay. Second thing is that the bees arrive too early or too late. Now, the issue here is that you are not the only customer for honeybee pollination. In the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of options going on. And the big thing is when those beekeepers go down to almonds, they're covering their costs. And when they come back into the region, they've got a couple options that hit you at pollination. So the one thing to keep in mind is that when they're down in almonds, it can be a bitch. So this was a couple years ago. That was raining like heck, and they were just stuck in the mud, and there were delays getting these bees back to you and getting them sorted and getting them up to strength. So there's a way in which, like almonds, and what happens in California is going to obviously affect what you're going to get down the line. There's a huge price differential in almond. They're paying this is from our 2016 survey, $185 Pacific Northwest beekeepers for almond pollination. And look at the number of colonies from the region that are going down there. But if you look at blueberry, you're competing with an awfully good crop, cherry. The rates are almost identical that they're paying out. And I'll tell you, put bees into cherry, sweet cherry, they look nice. And you put them in the blueberry, it's a lot tougher. You're going into a drier area with a really good nectar and pollen source, as opposed to a place where the bees may be stuck in their colonies for a few days because it's raining. And since there's no cranberry growers, I can't make the case here that clover seed is way more attractive than going into a cranberry bog. And so you're going to have a tough time competing with those growers. So getting them in at the right time can be challenging, and it involves kind of being able to coordinate with your beekeeper. Cultivar is the next issue that comes up, and this is work done at Simon Fraser University by an undergraduate. It's really remarkable. And she kind of asked the question, she said, you look at these blueberry flowers, they're all different shape, and the bee's head, honeybee's head's the same shape, and its tongue is a certain shape. Like, maybe sometimes the bees just can't get into these flowers, and that reduces their attractiveness to them. It's a great question. And so what she did is she measured some average size flowers, and then she looked at, I want to look at two things, the opening, which is the blue, the A, and the corolla length, which is D. And what she found is, in fact, there are some cultivars, like Duke, that have a big opening, and a bee can actually stick its head in a Duke flower and kind of get down into it. Whereas in some things like Liberty, it's just too tight. They can't get their head into a Liberty flower. They can only go as far as their tongue's going to go. And this is the issue. In some of these, so Duke is a very long length flower, but because they can get their head in it, they can get their tongue down, and so they're into those flowers. But some, like Blue Crop, because it's a slightly smaller opening, even though it's shorter, they can't get their head down there. And so what they end up doing, you'll see in this next slide, in Blue Crop, when you look at, there are those two slides. In Blue Crop, you can see, this is the number of visits, okay? So in Blue Crop, you see there's a lot of that gray on there. They're robbing. Because the flower is just kind of tight and a little bit longer, they just opt not to go down the middle of the flower, and they start going through the sides. And I showed you earlier that doesn't result in any pollen transfer. Duke, they like. It's big enough they can get their head in there, and even though it's long enough, they can kind of squeeze in and get their tongue in and probably do good pollination. But you can see in things like Liberty and Draper, in Liberty, the situation is you've got, even though it's a short flower, they just can't get their head in and their tongue down. And I hope this sounds kind of kinky, what I'm talking about right now, but sorry. Okay, so Draper is the other way. It's kind of like it's not as wide as Duke, so they just can't get their head in. So clearly, a big issue here is just the capacity for a bee to get into the flower, and the cultivars are driving this. It's really great work. Okay, why also is fruit set not perfect? Well, pollen isn't transferred enough, and we're going to hear some great work on pollen from the DeVetter lab later today. But this is what coming back to this slide, you got to pollinate all those 100 ovules to get maximum fruit size, and a lot of the time you just don't have the days to do that. So this is work from Michigan. You can see here two different temperatures. They went out and saw who was visiting the flowers. At 68, it's great. Honeybees are out. They're doing a lot of work. You can see they've got two different ears here. The gray bars are what they saw at 68 degree temperature. So honeybees are out there. They're dominating. But when you get cool, when you get to 52 Fahrenheit, look what's happening. In that 1 year, you have the bumblebees are kind of out. In the second year, the bumblebees are really kind of doing a lot of work. So, when you get these snaps of cold weather, pollen's not going to be transferred unless you have a high rate of some other kind of bee than honeybees. This graph is, I'm sorry to pummel you with graphs first thing in the morning. Are you guys okay? You're okay? Okay. So this graph goes through what they found. So if you just completely exclude, that's what E means. You just don't let any pollinators in. You get the fruit set is low, the weight of the berry is low, the number of seeds is low because they haven't been pollinated in both of these years. But what the next thing is what happens if they only do pollination in poor conditions? So they take the flowers and they only open them up when it's crappy outside. So this is an example of what you would get if it was just terrible conditions, the entire pollination. And you can see there's a real reduction in the weight of the berries compared to the open, when they're just open all the time. And the number of mature seeds is poor. So you're just, when the key message here is when it's poor, you're really kind of getting a really bad fruit set. And when things are good, when you have increasing pollination at times when things are good, fruit weight goes up, fruit set goes up, and the number of seeds, which correlates with berry weight, goes up. Okay. Third reason is the pollen isn't compatible. And this is an issue that I'm kind of interested in. It's been kicked around in the literature. This is a study that was done out east. And what they did is for all the varieties on to the right of blue crop, they cross-pollinated it with blue crop pollen. And then with blue crop, they cross-pollinated with rubel. Is that how you say it? Rubel pollen? Anyways, you'll see that on average, you get a 46% increase in fruit sets across these varieties when you use outcross pollen, blue crop being the exception. And you're also getting like a 20-25% jump in fruit weight when you're outcrossing with something else, rubel being the exception. There is also a way in which pollen quantity comes into play. So if you have crossing compatibility, it seems to be overpowered by quantity. And this was very careful research that was done at Simon Fraser University, where they took, I don't know how they did this, it's like angels dancing on the head of a pin. They took pollen grains, they put 25 tetrads. Remember, a pollen grain has like a pollen tetrad. The little package it comes down has 4 pollen grains. So they put 100 pollen grains. And remember, there's 100 ovules, so that should like totally pollinate it. And then they bumped it up to 125 tetrads, which is like 5 times the number of pollen grains per ovule. What they found is that if you look at fruit set, let's just look at that top graph. If you do 25, you should get perfect fruit set. Down at the mid one. Third from the bottom. So fruit set should be perfect. You put 25 tetrads down, there's enough pollen grains there to pollinate the whole thing. But look, they're only getting 50% fruit set. You only get approaching 100% fruit set when you either start to get that, you can see the last two. So there's 125 that's self-pollinated, gets them up to about 70%, but you only get to 80% fruit set. Oh, sure. Okay.
Help with the graph. Other options if you just move the mouse around.
Oh, fantastic.
That's corner.
Wow. Thank you, Betsy. That's amazing. Okay, so you can see here, as soon as you go, so this is like selfing with 125 pollen grains. Remember, that's 5 times the number of pollen grains to set all those ovules. You're getting to 60%, and you really, when you introduce some cross pollen, either a combination of self and cross or totally cross pollen, you can see you're getting at that very high level of fruit set. And a lot of this is mirrored in numbers of days to ripen, and also the fruit weights. So there is a way in which, like, a bee that comes in and just deposits the minimal amount of pollen grains is going to be fine. But if you're depositing a whole lot more pollen, you're going to be able to overcome some of these fruit set problems. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about with this issue is, and I've been curious about this, is ovule senescence. This is work that's been done in cherry, and I've not seen any of this work done in blueberries. So in cherries, there's a bunch of varieties that, this is nice work that was done at WSU, where they looked at the ovules as they developed, and they looked at how quick they pooped out. And you'll see what they did is they took these cherries, they took them into the lab, and they subjected them to a high temperature regime where it was peaking at noon at 20 degrees centigrade. And they had some sort of milder conditions. That's the dotted lines below. And what they found is with some of their cultivars, like Rainier or Benton, it didn't matter. You took them up to this high temperature regime, and those ovules the frequency of those ovules kind of pooping out is really low. But it's with some of the cultivars like Sweetheart and Regina, when you take them up to those high temperatures, those ovules are 50% here are dying. These are different cultivars here as the graphs at those high temperatures. So there's a way in which it's possible that there are high temperature conditions in a cool season crop like blueberry may lead to some problems that even if you're depositing the pollen, if you're not doing it fast enough, that ovule is going to die. So cherry growers have been experimenting with Retain. It's a growth regulator. It's what prevents a banana from kind of ripening. So it kind of here you can see if you were to spray a banana with Retain, it would just stay kind of green. It wouldn't kind of senescence. And what they're finding is that when you apply Retain to the flowers at 10% bloom and 100% bloom, you get this real bump in fruit set. There's an increase in fruit set. And I'm really kind of curious if there are these kinds of problems in some of the berry crops and if they can be mitigated with something like Retain. Okay, last thing, pollination isn't everything. I actually hate this. This isn't every bee talk. Without bees, you would be missing half the grocery shelf. But it really kind of assumes that the only input in agriculture is pollination, and that's clearly not the case. I started my research in lowbush blueberry out in Maine, and I was really struck by this graph. This was an extension agent out in Nova Scotia who collected years and years and years and years of hive density and yield data. And what's interesting is, of course, as you increase hive density, you get higher yields. But look at the variation. Like this guy here has got 0 hives per acre and is getting sort of maximal yield. So clearly there are other things driving fruit set. Leaf disease. I was interested in leaf diseases and monolinea. There's floral blights and botrytis. Because clearly, if a pollination event takes place and that flower dies, you're not going to get any fruit. And so I did a study where I either treated with fungicide and insecticide or withheld those inputs, and I put them in a situation where I controlled the pollination. I either gave them all the pollination or restricted the pollination. So here you can see the plots. I applied fungicide and insecticide as recommended. Then I covered the whole thing up and I put bumblebees in there, and some of the blocks I restricted at 25% bloom. And what I found was when you look at fruit set, in fact, you have this relationship where when you have all the inputs, you actually do see this increase in fruit set, but you don't see this increase in fruit set if you withhold the fungicides. If you withhold the fungicides, then you're not going to see that bump in fruit set. Same thing happened to fruit weight. You would imagine over here, these bushes here didn't have a lot of fruit set, so you'd expect them to bump up their weight. But what I saw was the opposite. I only saw an increase in fruit weight. I didn't see that when I withheld the treatment. I didn't see this bump up in fruit weight because things like leaf diseases and defoliators. So that plant just could not juice up those berries. So clearly, I'm not going to go into this. It's like a big fancy experiment I did, and there was all sorts of things that I did. Don't worry about it. But when I went through and I looked at this is what it looks like in lowbush blueberry. It's a really hard system to pollinate. So you start off in these 2 years with somewhere around 30 or 25 flowers per stem. And you'll see by fruit set, you're losing. A lot of those flowers aren't making it to fruit set. And when you get to harvest, you've lost even more berries. And when I asked, in 2014, in fact, when I looked at those drops, one of the big steps that took place was not honeybee visitation, but bumblebee visitation, but also other things that had nothing to do with pollination. So how many flowers were set on that stem the year before, and also things like magnesium and calcium levels in the tissue at fruit set. But in the year previous to that, the things like defoliators and the weed pressure that was on those bushes was really driving fruit set. It really wasn't pollination that was driving anything. Okay, so why fruits? I think we've covered everything here. What can you do about it? The first thing is to get bigger colonies, get the higher stocking rates, I think, and get those colonies, make sure they're arriving early at 15% bloom. You don't want them to come late. The second thing you can do is with those, when you have these harder to cultivate pollinate varieties, you may need to sort of really bump up the stocking rates to get the pollination done. You want to also try to encourage some of these other pollinators. We saw that study with the mason bees. We actually have a mason bee guy here, Jim Watts. If you want to play with mason bees, talk to Jim. But also encourage these bumblebees by building habitat. And the last thing is keep those plants healthy. It doesn't matter how much pollination you do. If you can't retain those berries or those plants can't bear it, they're not going to do it. Okay, so based on what you learned today, what are you going to do? Might you increase the stocking rate? It's like, oh, I didn't know about the stocking rate thing. One of the options at the bottom is nothing. I do all this already. You're an entertaining speaker, thank you, but I didn't actually learn that much. The second thing is decrease stocking rate. You think you're going too high. You've got too many surrounding maples, and you're just losing those bees, you think. You're going to inspect the colony strength. You're going to go out and actually look. Maybe those colonies you're getting aren't as strong as you think they are. Maybe you're going to, Tim is going to be talking about native bee habitat. Maybe you're going to try and get some of those native bees going by creating some habitat. Maybe you're going to pay more or get better colonies or something else. So go ahead and vote, and I hope I can show you the results. I have a feeling it's not going to show up. Drat, I don't know why that's doing that. Okay, the last question I promise to get out of your hair here is, oh. No, that was it. Great. Thanks, everybody. Good luck in 2019.
How you doing, guy?
I'm doing great. How you doing? Good. The problem is I can't pull this thing out.
Sorry. Coming at you with the mic. Andony, I think you've got
Feel
a
that.
question here. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, good. Great. Okay.
We have time for a couple questions.
Oh, okay, great. Awesome.
I was just wondering, what is the active ingredient in Retain? You mentioned it was a growth stimulant, but
Yeah, it's no, I don't know. Anybody know what's in Retain? I don't know what it is. I'm not a plant physiologist. I know what it does, but I don't know what it is. And it also has to be registered for blueberries, so trials would have to be done.
It could be an ethylene blocker or delay.
Thank you. Ethylene blocker delay. You heard that.
Does anyone else have any questions? Well, Andy's going to be giving us another great talk a little later. If you think of anything that you want to ask, we're going to have a really